I knew something was wrong the moment my daughter-in-law smiled at me like I was a guest in my own home. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and until last Thanksgiving, I believed I had built a family strong enough to carry me through the rest of my life. That morning started like so many others I had hosted for over 30 years, with the smell of roasted turkey filling my suburban Ohio kitchen, the ticking of the old wall clock my late husband bought me back in 1985, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had done everything right for my family. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., tied my apron the same way I always did, and began preparing dishes that had become tradition: sweet potato casserole with toasted marshmallows, green beans with crispy onions, and my famous pecan pie that my son Daniel used to beg for when he was just a boy. Back then, he would stand on a chair beside me, sneaking handfuls of sugar when he thought I wasn't looking. I smiled at the memory as I basted the turkey, believing those simple moments meant something permanent, something unbreakable. By noon, the house was ready, the table set with my best china, the one I only brought out for special occasions, and the chairs arranged carefully so everyone had a place. Everyone had always had a place here. Or at least, that's what I thought. Daniel arrived first, but something about him felt distant. He hugged me, but it was quick, distracted, like he was already somewhere else. Then came Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, walking in with that polished smile she wore like a mask. She looked around the house, not with warmth, but with something I couldn't quite place at the time, something closer to evaluation than appreciation. "Everything looks nice," she said, her tone light but hollow, as if she were complimenting a hotel instead of the home I had poured my life into. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. People change, I reminded myself. Life gets busy. But then, as more family members arrived, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. Vanessa rearranged place cards I had already set. She whispered things to Daniel that made him glance at me, then quickly look away. And when it was finally time to sit down, when I reached for my usual seat at the head of the table, the one my husband insisted was mine after he passed, I found Vanessa standing there, her hand resting casually on the chair like it had always belonged to her. She looked at me, still smiling, and said, "Oh, Margaret, we thought it might be better if you sat over there this year. Just for a change." A change. That word echoed in my mind as I looked at the seat she pointed to, down the table, near the corner, away from the center, away from where I had always been. It was a small thing, something most people might laugh off, but in that moment, it felt like the ground beneath me had shifted. I hesitated, just for a second, waiting for Daniel to say something, to correct it, to remind her that this was my home. But he didn't. He simply pulled out his chair beside her and avoided my eyes. And that was the moment I realized something had changed in a way I couldn't yet fully understand. The house was still mine, the food was still mine, the traditions were still mine, but somehow, I was no longer at the center of any of it. I sat where she told me to sit, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my smile polite and controlled, but inside, something quiet and steady began to crack, because for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger at my own table, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger than a seating arrangement. The moment I realized something was wrong was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost polite, like a door closing softly in a house you thought you still owned. And it happened the morning after that dinner when I woke up earlier than usual, out of habit more than anything, and walked into the kitchen expecting the same warmth I had felt for years, only to find the air colder, the cabinets rearranged, and my favorite mug missing from its usual place as if I had already been erased in small, careful steps. And when I asked my daughter-in-law about it, she smiled in that thin way that never quite reached her eyes and said they were just making things more efficient, more modern, as if I were some outdated piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. And I stood there holding the edge of the counter, reminding myself that this was still my home, the house I had paid off over 30 years, the place where I raised my son after his father passed, the place where every wall held a memory that I could still name with my eyes closed. And yet somehow I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, and it did not stop there, because over the next few days I noticed how decisions were made without me, how conversations would pause when I entered the room, how my son, who once asked my opinion on everything from fixing a leaky sink to choosing a birthday gift, now avoided my gaze as if it were easier to pretend nothing had changed than to admit that everything had. And one afternoon, I found a stack of papers on the dining table, neatly clipped together, with my address printed at the top, but not my name. And when I picked them up, I saw it was a refinancing document. My house. My name nowhere in sight except in a small section that required a signature. And that was when my hands began to tremble, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of understanding settling into my bones. Because this was not confusion or forgetfulness. This was planning. This was intention. And when I confronted my son later that evening, he did not deny it. He just sighed like a man tired of carrying a burden and said they were trying to secure their future, that it was complicated, that I would not understand the financial side of things. And I remember looking at him and seeing a stranger where my little boy used to be, and I asked him quietly if securing their future meant removing me from it. And he did not answer right away, which was answer enough. And in that silence, I felt something inside me shift, something that had been patient for far too long finally straightening its back. Because I had spent years believing that love meant giving without question, sacrificing without keeping score, trusting that the people you raised would never turn your kindness into an opportunity. But standing there in my own living room, holding papers that tried to rewrite my place in the world, I understood that love without boundaries becomes permission, and I had given them too much of that. And as I placed those papers back on the table with steady hands, I realized that whatever came next would not be decided for me. Not quietly, not politely, and certainly not without my voice being heard. That night, I did not sleep much, not because I was afraid, but because my mind was finally clear in a way it had not been for years, as if all the small doubts I had ignored were lining up one by one, asking to be acknowledged. And I let them. I let myself remember every moment I had brushed aside, every time my daughter-in-law corrected me in my own kitchen, every time my son chose silence over standing beside me. Every time I told myself that keeping peace was more important than being respected. And by the time the sun rose, I was no longer confused about what was happening. I was certain, and certainty, I realized, is a powerful thing when you have spent too long second-guessing your own worth. So I made my coffee in a plain glass instead of my missing mug and sat at the table where those papers had been left like a test I was expected to fail. And I began to think not as a mother trying to hold her family together, but as a woman who had built something with her own hands and had every right to protect it. And later that morning when my daughter-in-law walked in, dressed neatly as if she had somewhere important to be, I watched her carefully, not with anger, but with a calm attention she had never seen from me before, and she noticed. I could tell by the way her movements slowed just slightly, and when she asked if I had looked at the documents, I answered yes, but I did not say anything more, and that unsettled her more than any argument could have. Because she was expecting resistance she could dismiss, not silence she could not read. And when my son joined us, he avoided the topic at first, talking about errands and schedules as if we were all still playing the same comfortable roles. But I did not follow his lead. I simply asked him when exactly they had planned to discuss transferring ownership of my house without me. And the words hung in the air, simple and direct, leaving no room for confusion or excuses, and he shifted in his seat, glancing at his wife before saying they thought it would be easier this way, that it would reduce stress for everyone. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so carefully phrased, so deliberately gentle, like wrapping something sharp in soft fabric. And I told them I understood exactly what they were trying to do. And that was the moment everything changed, because for the first time they could not hide behind explanations or pretend I was unaware, and I could see it in their faces. That brief flicker of uncertainty, as if they were realizing that the version of me they had counted on was no longer sitting across from them. And I stood up slowly, not in anger, but with purpose, and said that before any further conversations happened, there were things I needed to review and decisions I needed to make on my own. And I did not ask for permission. I did not seek agreement. I simply stated it as fact and walked out of the room, leaving them in a silence they had created but no longer controlled. And as I stepped outside into the cool morning air, I felt something unfamiliar but steady settle inside me. Not bitterness, not revenge, but a quiet resolve that whatever they had planned behind my back would not be the final chapter of my story, because I was still here, still thinking, still capable. And for the first time in a long while, I was no longer reacting to what they did. I was preparing for what I would do next. By the time I returned inside, the house felt different again, but this time it was not because they had changed something. It was because I had, and that shift followed me through the hallway, into the living room, into every corner where I had once felt uncertain, and instead of questioning myself, I began observing everything with quiet clarity, noticing how my daughter-in-law kept glancing at her phone, likely messaging someone about me, about what had just happened, and how my son paced near the window as if he were trying to calculate his next move. And for the first time I saw them not as family members I needed to protect, but as adults making deliberate choices, and that distinction mattered more than anything, because it meant I no longer had to excuse their behavior as misunderstanding or stress. And later that afternoon, I went to my bedroom and opened the small wooden box I had kept locked for years, the one that held documents I rarely needed but had never thrown away. And as I flipped through old property records, insurance papers, and handwritten notes from a time when life was simpler, I felt a sense of grounding return to me, because these were proof of something real, something earned, something that could not be quietly rewritten without my consent. And I took my time, reading each page carefully, reminding myself of the details I had once handled without hesitation, and it became clear that I still understood far more than they believed I did. And that realization brought with it a calm confidence that settled deep in my chest. And when I finally stepped back into the main part of the house in the early evening, I did not announce what I had been doing. I did not offer explanations. I simply carried myself differently, and they noticed immediately. My daughter-in-law tried to smile again, that same practiced expression, but this time it faltered just enough to reveal the tension underneath. And my son asked if everything was all right in a tone that sounded more cautious than concerned, and I answered him honestly. I said everything would be, and I meant it, just not in the way they expected. And then I did something small but significant. I went into the kitchen and rearranged a few items back to where they had always been, not aggressively, not as a confrontation, but as a quiet reminder that this space had a history that did not begin with their plans. And as I placed my hand on the counter I had leaned on the day before, I felt steady, not because the situation was resolved, but because I was no longer standing still inside it. And that evening passed with an unusual stillness. No one brought up the documents again. No one tried to push the conversation further. But beneath that silence I could sense their uncertainty growing, because they no longer knew how I would respond. And that uncertainty shifted the balance in a way words never could. And as I sat alone later that night, looking around the home I had built piece by piece, I understood that what they had mistaken for weakness was simply patience, and patience, when it reaches its limit, does not disappear, it transforms, and mine had already begun to do exactly that, shaping itself into something far more deliberate, something that would not be rushed or pressured, something that would unfold on my terms, one careful step at a time. The next morning I did something I had not done in years. I left the house without telling anyone where I was going, not out of secrecy, but out of reclaiming something simple that had quietly slipped away from me, the right to move through my own life without explanation. And as I drove down familiar streets, past grocery stores and quiet neighborhoods that had not changed in decades, I felt a steady sense of purpose guiding me, because this was no longer about reacting to what had been placed in front of me. It was about stepping ahead of it. And when I arrived at the small office building I had chosen, I sat in my car for a moment, not hesitating but grounding myself in the reality of what I was about to do, reminding myself that I was not being dramatic or impulsive. I was being responsible for something I had every right to protect. And when I walked inside and spoke with the receptionist, my voice was calm and clear, and as I waited, I noticed how different it felt to be in a space where no one assumed I was unaware or easily guided, where my questions were answered directly and my presence was taken seriously. And that alone strengthened my resolve more than anything else. And during that meeting I laid out the situation without exaggeration, explaining the documents I had seen, the pressure I had felt, and the changes that had been happening in my home. And as I spoke, I realized how important it was that I had come before anything had been signed, before anything had been quietly finalized behind my back, because now there was still time, still control, still a path forward that belonged to me. And when I left that office I carried more than just information. I carried a sense of direction, a clear understanding of the steps I could take to ensure that no one could simply move me aside in a story I had written with my own life. and by the time I returned home in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the front yard, I could already feel the difference in how I would handle whatever came next. And inside the house, the atmosphere shifted the moment I walked through the door. My daughter-in-law looked up quickly, her expression searching for clues, and my son followed soon after, asking casually where I had been, and I answered simply that I had taken care of a few things, and I did not elaborate, not because I was hiding anything, but because not every step I took needed to be explained to people who had already shown me how little they valued my place in their plans. And that evening, as we sat at the dinner table in a silence that felt heavier than before, I noticed how their confidence had begun to fade, replaced by a cautious attention, as if they were waiting for me to reveal something they could not predict. And for the first time since this all began, I allowed that silence to work in my favor, because I understood now that control does not always come from speaking louder or arguing harder. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly what you are doing while others are left guessing. And as I cleared my plate and stood up from the table, I realized that whatever they had set in motion had already begun to unravel, not because I had confronted them directly, but because I had quietly stepped out of the role they had assigned to me, and into one they could no longer manage or manipulate. And that was only the beginning of what I intended to do next. The following day unfolded with a kind of quiet tension that no one dared to name, and I could feel it in the way my son lingered near me more than usual, as if he were trying to read my thoughts without asking directly, and in the way my daughter-in-law suddenly became overly attentive, offering small gestures that felt rehearsed rather than sincere, like refilling my glass before it was empty or asking if I needed anything in a tone that carried more calculation than care. And I observed all of it without reacting, not because I was indifferent, but because I understood now that their behavior was shifting in response to uncertainty, and uncertainty, when handled properly, has a way of revealing far more than confrontation ever could. And as the hours passed, I continued moving through the house with a steady calm, doing ordinary things like folding laundry and watering the plants. But internally, I was organizing my next steps with clarity and intention, and by the early afternoon I decided it was time to introduce just enough truth to reshape the balance between us. Not everything, not yet, but enough to make it clear that the path they had chosen was no longer under their control. And when we gathered in the living room later that day, I chose my moment carefully, waiting until both of them were present and settled, and then I spoke in a tone that was neither harsh nor hesitant, simply firm, and I told them that I had taken the time to review my options thoroughly, and that I had already begun putting certain protections in place regarding the house and my financial matters. And I watched as the words landed, as their expressions shifted from curiosity to concern, and my son immediately asked what I meant, his voice tighter than before, while my daughter-in-law remained silent but visibly alert, and I explained that I had consulted the appropriate professionals and that any decisions involving my property would move forward only with my full understanding and agreement, and that no documents would be signed under pressure or assumption. And I kept my explanation clear and measured, avoiding details that were not necessary, while making the message unmistakable. And in that moment I saw something change in both of them. A realization that whatever plan they had quietly set in motion was no longer progressing as expected, and my son tried to respond with reassurance, saying they had only wanted to help, that they were thinking of the future, but his words lacked the confidence they once carried. And I listened without interrupting, allowing him to finish before calmly saying that a future built without honesty is not something I would participate in, and that simple statement seemed to settle heavily in the room, because it left no space for argument without exposing the truth they had tried to soften. And after that the conversation faded into silence, but it was no longer the same silence as before. This one belonged to me, shaped by the boundaries I had finally set, and as I stood up and walked away, I could feel their attention following me, not with control or expectation, but with uncertainty and a growing awareness that I was no longer someone they could quietly move aside. And later that evening, as I sat alone once again, I reflected not on what I had lost, but on what I had regained, my clarity, my authority, and most importantly, my voice. And I knew that this was only one step in a larger process, but it was a necessary one, because from this point forward, every move I made would be deliberate, and every decision would come from a place they could no longer influence or undermine. And that understanding gave me a quiet strength that no one in that house could take away. By the time the sun dipped behind the maple trees lining the quiet suburban street, I had already made 3 phone calls that would quietly change everything. And yet no one inside that house had any idea what was coming. Not even Daniel, who sat at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone as if the world still belonged to him. As if the foundation beneath his feet had not already begun to shift, and especially not Melissa, who was upstairs laughing on the phone with her sister, her voice light and careless in a way that used to make me feel like an outsider in my own home, but now only strengthened my resolve, because for the first time in months, I was no longer reacting to their cruelty. I was directing the next chapter of my life with precision and calm. I stood by the window, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, watching the reflection of a woman I barely recognized, not because she was broken, but because she had finally stopped pretending everything was fine, and that realization settled deep into my bones like something permanent and unshakable. Earlier that afternoon, I had met with Mr. Henderson, the attorney who had helped my late husband draft our original estate plan over 20 years ago, and as I sat across from him in that quiet office with its dark wood shelves and soft lighting, I laid out everything that had happened, every detail of how I had been gradually pushed aside, dismissed, and ultimately treated as though I were nothing more than a burden in the very home I had helped build. And he listened without interruption, his expression steady, his tone respectful. And when I finished, he simply nodded and said, "Then it is time to protect yourself properly." And those words felt like permission, like validation I had been denied for far too long. By the time I left his office, new documents were already in motion, my assets secured, my authority clearly defined, and most importantly, my future no longer tied to people who had shown me exactly how little they valued me. And as I drove home, I realized something I should have understood much sooner, that love without respect is not love at all, and sacrifice without appreciation only invites more taking. Back in the house, I moved quietly, deliberately, preparing dinner as I always had, not because I owed them anything, but because tonight was not about confrontation, it was about timing, and timing, I had learned, was everything. When Melissa finally came downstairs, she barely glanced at me, offering a quick, distracted thank you as she reached for a plate, her attention already drifting elsewhere, and Daniel followed shortly after, his presence heavy but distant, and as we sat at the table, the same table where I had once imagined years of shared laughter and warmth, there was an unspoken tension that only I seemed to understand. Because while they believed this was just another ordinary evening, I knew it was the last one that would ever look like this. I watched them carefully, noting the small things I had ignored before. The way Melissa subtly corrected Daniel when he spoke, the way Daniel avoided eye contact with me, the way neither of them asked how I was or what I had been doing, and for the first time, instead of feeling hurt, I felt clarity, because their behavior no longer confused me. It confirmed everything. After dinner, as they returned to their routines, I cleared the table slowly, my movements calm and steady, and when the house finally settled into silence, I walked to my room, closed the door behind me, and placed the neatly organized folder on my dresser, the papers inside representing not just legal decisions, but a reclaiming of my dignity, my independence, and my voice. And as I sat on the edge of my bed, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, not out of spite, but out of certainty, because tomorrow, everything would begin to change, and this time, I would not be the one caught off guard. The next morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost unfamiliar, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something it could not yet understand, and I woke before sunrise, not out of habit, but out of purpose, because today was no longer about enduring what had been done to me. It was about quietly stepping into the life I had already begun to reclaim, and as I dressed, I chose my clothes with care, not for appearance, but for the quiet confidence they gave me, a simple, navy blouse and pressed slacks, the kind of outfit that reminded me I was still capable, still in control, still the woman who had once managed a household, a budget, and a future with clarity and strength. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty, the silence uninterrupted, and for a moment I allowed myself to stand there, taking in the space that had once felt so heavy with unspoken tension, and now felt almost neutral, as if it no longer had the power to define me. and I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, the aroma grounding me as I mentally walked through the steps I had already set in motion, each one deliberate, each one necessary. At exactly 9:30, my phone rang, and I answered without hesitation, hearing the calm, professional voice of the property manager confirming that everything was ready. The small but comfortable apartment across town prepared exactly as requested, the lease finalized, utilities arranged, and keys available for pickup that very afternoon. And as I thanked her, I felt a quiet sense of relief settle in, not because I was escaping, but because I was choosing something better, something mine. When Daniel finally came downstairs, he seemed surprised to see me already dressed, already composed, his brow furrowing slightly as he glanced at the clock and then back at me, as if trying to place what felt different. But he said nothing at first, and I could see that familiar hesitation in his posture, the same avoidance that had grown between us over the past year. And Melissa followed shortly after, her expression distracted, her attention already on her phone, and neither of them noticed the packed suitcase resting neatly by the front door until I stepped aside just enough for it to come into view. And in that moment, the air shifted, subtle but undeniable. Daniel's voice broke the silence, cautious and uncertain, asking where I was going. And I turned to face him fully, my expression calm, my tone steady, and for the first time in a very long while, I did not soften my words to make him comfortable. I simply told the truth, that I was leaving, that I had made other arrangements, and that it was time for all of us to move forward separately. And the confusion on his face was immediate, followed by something deeper, something that looked almost like realization, as if he was finally beginning to understand that my silence over the past months had not been weakness, but preparation. Melissa's reaction was sharper, her voice quick and edged with disbelief as she asked what I meant, as if the idea of me making a decision without their input had never crossed her mind. And I met her gaze without hesitation, explaining clearly that the house, the finances, and everything tied to my name had already been legally secured, that I had taken the necessary steps to ensure my independence, and that from this point forward, I would be managing my own affairs without interference. And while I did not raise my voice, there was a firmness in my words that left no room for misunderstanding. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been, because it carried the weight of truth. And as I reached for my suitcase, I paused just long enough to look at Daniel, not with anger, but with a quiet finality, and I told him that I had spent years believing that family meant standing by each other no matter what, but I had learned that respect must exist alongside love, and without it, there is nothing left to hold on to. And he did not argue. He did not interrupt. He simply stood there, absorbing the consequences of choices he had allowed to unfold. As I walked to the door, the morning light spilling across the entryway, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not sadness, not fear, but a steady, grounded sense of freedom. And when I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with a quiet, definitive click, I knew that whatever came next would be shaped by my own decisions, my own boundaries, and my own worth. And for the first time in a very long while, that was more than enough. The drive across town felt longer than it actually was, not because of distance but because of the quiet shift happening inside me, the steady unraveling of the life I had held together for so long. And as I kept my hands firmly on the steering wheel, I noticed how calm I felt, not rushed, not second-guessing, just certain. And that certainty carried me all the way to the small apartment complex tucked between a row of oak trees and a quiet street, where the traffic moved slowly and the air felt lighter. And when I parked my car and stepped out, I paused for a moment, taking in the building that would now hold the next chapter of my life. Not grand, not impressive, but clean, quiet, and entirely mine. The property manager greeted me with a warm but professional smile, handing me the keys and walking me through the space, pointing out the details as if they mattered. And for the first time in a long while, they did matter, because every corner of that apartment represented something I had chosen for myself. The small kitchen with sunlight coming through the window, the living room just large enough for a comfortable chair and a bookshelf, the bedroom simple and peaceful. And as I stepped inside fully, I felt a quiet sense of ownership settle in, not over the walls or the furniture, but over my own life. After she left, the silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not heavy or filled with tension. It was open, almost welcoming, and I set my suitcase down near the door before slowly walking through each room again, letting the reality of it all sink in, that I had walked away not out of defeat, but out of clarity, and that difference changed everything. By early afternoon, I had begun unpacking, placing my clothes neatly into the closet, arranging a few personal items on the dresser, small things that carried memories but no longer carried pain, and as I worked, my phone remained on the kitchen counter, silent at first, until eventually it lit up with Daniel's name, and I watched it ring without moving, not out of anger, but because I understood that whatever he wanted to say now was coming from a place that was already too late, and when the call ended, a message followed, then another, each one carrying a tone I recognized, confusion mixed with urgency, but no real understanding of what had led to this moment, and I let the phone rest, because for the first time, I did not feel responsible for managing his emotions. As the afternoon stretched on, I stepped out onto the small balcony, the wooden railing warm under my hands as I looked out over the quiet street below, watching a couple walk their dog, a neighbor watering plants, ordinary moments that felt strangely comforting, and I realized how long it had been since I had felt part of something simple and calm, without the undercurrent of tension that had filled my previous home. Later, I made myself a light dinner, something easy and familiar, and I sat alone at the small table by the window, not with loneliness, but with a sense of peace that I had almost forgotten was possible, and as I ate, I reflected on everything that had brought me here, not just the recent months of quiet dismissal and disrespect, but the years of giving without question, of putting others first without ever asking whether I was being valued in return, and that reflection did not fill me with regret. It filled me with understanding, because I could see now that I had been living in a pattern that needed to end. As evening settled in, my phone rang again, and this time I answered, not because I felt obligated, but because I was ready, and Daniel's voice came through softer than I had ever heard it, uncertain, almost careful, asking where I was and if we could talk, and I listened without interrupting, letting him speak in a way he never had before, but when he finished, I responded calmly, explaining that I was safe, that I had made my decision with thought and intention, and that this was not something that would be undone by a single conversation. And there was a pause on the line, long and heavy, before he quietly asked if this was really how things were going to be, and I answered with the same steady clarity I had carried all day, telling him that this was how things already were, and that now, I was simply choosing to live in truth rather than in silence. And when the call ended, I set the phone down, gently, not with finality, but with acceptance, and as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed in a place that was entirely my own, I felt something settle deep within me, not just peace, but a quiet strength that told me I had not lost anything that truly belonged to me. I had only finally let go of what never did.